Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about ending the cocoa crisis. How is industry responding? And this is going to be a follow-up on a couple of previous episodes that I have done. But before we jump into the meat of the program today, or the heart of the program, the nibs of the program, however you want to characterize it, just a quick shout out to all of the members of the Chocolate Life, because this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members. And you can go, over to the Chocolate Life today. This is the home page. You can click on the green button in the top nav. If you're not logged in, it'll say join, and you can become either a free member or a premium member of the Chocolate Life and support what we do. And while you're at it, if you're watching on YouTube, do all the stuff, ring the bells, check the subscribe, all the things that are done to help promote, comment, like, all that kind of stuff. It helps grow the channel specifically. And also, a quick reminder that no matter where you are in the world, you can go into the live chat on YouTube or in the comments on LinkedIn and Facebook. You can give a quick shout out. You can say, hi, I'm blah, here's my name and here's where in the world I am connecting from. And I'll get that shout out up on screen. And then, of course, if you have a comment or a question about anything that is going on today, you can get that up and I will get it up during the course of the episode and ask and answer it or do my best. And if not, what I will do is after the episode is over, what I can do is I can go to the post that I create for every episode, and down in the member discussion at the bottom of the post, I can get your question into the member discussion. It's here somewhere. There we are, the member discussion. I can get your question in the member discussion and I can answer it. So if I don't answer it during the course of the episode. With that, let's go back to the top and talk about ending the cocoa process, ending the cocoa crisis. How is industry responding? And I'm following up, and you can follow along if you're watching, because there's a run of episodes. So there's an outline to how I'm going to be approaching the topic, which is just following along by reading the post, and you'll get a pretty good idea. And if there's anything new that I bring up, so something that I refer to, I could put the links to that on the page as well. So you don't have to really pay attention to where the URLs are during the course of the episode to follow along. So in a recent episode of Pod Save Chocolate, so this is episode number 140, what I did is I took a look at what the International Cocoa Initiative is doing and proposing to end the root causes of illegal labor in the cocoa supply chain. And they point out that the root cause of illegal labor, let me get rid of this, excuse me. The root cause of illegal labor in the cocoa supply chain is the fact that farmers are poor, number one, right? And rather than addressing that issue, which is farmers are poor, what they said, we're going to recommend that we do more monitoring and remediation. So what we're going to do is we're going to go find out where illegal labor exists, and we're going to find ways to remediate it. We're going to find some ways to take these children who are engaged in illegal activity and then move them out of illegal activity. But there's nothing in what it is that the International Cocoa Initiative does or promotes, at least from my research when it comes to this episode, that suggests that, we actually have a solution for the root cause of illegal labor in the cocoa supply chain. And I think, that's, really a major flaw in the ICI approach. While remediation, monitoring will let us know if there is an issue, and it will let us know where there is an issue, it doesn't tell us anything about how to address the root causes of the issue. And one of the points that I want to make here is that by focusing almost exclusively on illegal labor, right, what Big Chocolate is doing is they're ignoring the systemic problems that they have, is that addressing the root causes of illegal child labor will not address the root causes of farmer lives and livelihoods. Although farmer lives, it's a quality of life issue, but it doesn't solve the how do I get enough income as a cocoa farmer in order to be able to have a good life, to be able to provide for my family, to be able to maintain my farms, right? That the International Cocoa Initiative approach doesn't address that problem. But I also think it's set up there as, ooh, it's a bright, shiny thing, almost like a red herring. Hey, pay attention to this, right? And we'll stop talking about addressing the root causes. I think that's a real problem, right? And what we want to do is we want to go see if we can find out what the root causes are going to be. And so you can go and you can read the post and you can watch the episode and you can say, hey, Clay, I think you're right. I think you're wrong. Let me know in the comments on that post or in the comments on this post. What do you think about that idea? So since this post, episode 140, which was a couple of weeks ago, I did another episode, which is the next episode, as a matter of fact, which was for my August News and AMA Ask Me Anything episode, which was about the future of the cocoa value chain or the chocolate value chain. I always go through, what is the cost of cocoa as a part of this. There's some news. One of the things which appears to be happening, which I talked about, is there's an update. This company, Hartree Partners, which is a US-based energy and commodities trader, is in advanced talk to purchase a French agro-industrial firm and one of the largest cocoa traders in the world called Touton, which handles on its own nearly 10% of the global cocoa trade. So Hartree has already purchased a UK company called ED&F Man. And so all of a sudden we have this commodities and energy trader is becoming a major player in the global cocoa supply. But you can take a look at what it is that I've done here. And again, as you think about what it is that I'm talking about, go back to those previous two episodes, listen through them, read through them, and go, oh, where are the connections here? What do we need to worry about? And is anybody actually working to address the issue of farmer lives and livelihoods? And the living income reference price is another red herring, in my opinion. By focusing on an external, which is an international view of what it means to have a living income, right? People are not paying attention to what is the root cause or what are the root causes of farmers not having a living income in the first place. So what they're doing is they're putting a Band-Aid, right? And they're not addressing the root, a bandage on part of the symptoms or some of the symptoms, but they're not taking a look at, okay, what is the underlying disease, right, which is leading to these symptoms in the first place. So one of the ways, trying to tie all these things together, one of the ways in which industry is responding, right, is that they are looking at cocoa alternatives, right? So if the cocoa supply chain is getting tight, if we can't rely on volume out of West Africa, if we can't rely on the market price to settle down, there's still a huge amount of volatility. You go and take a look, right, and you can see that there's a huge amount of volatility. And then we're also taking a look at the disintegration, the collapse in real time of Barry Callebaut. I mean, I'm going to go out and I'm writing another article on this, and I talked about it in last Friday's episode. But we may be looking at the dissolution of Barry Callebaut as we have known it since 1996 happening in real time. And I will go over that in a new post, and I may do an episode dedicated to it. But there is an episode of PodSafe Chocolate. Let's go to the homepage. If you're interested in just getting an introduction to the Callebaut crisis, the end of a dynasty, what's really interesting about this is that I came to the conclusions that I did only from public reporting. It is after I posted this and did the episode last Friday that, or last Tuesday, that people have come to me and said, "Hey, Clay, you were closer to the truth than you could possibly know." And so I do have some additional information that I can add. So go take a look at this. And for example, what would the dismantling and selling off the major parts or some major parts of Barry Callebaut do, and rebranding, which is already underway, due to the largest business-to-business chocolate processor in the world? And what would that do to the market? Now, it's important to know that Callebaut as a company, in the broad scheme of things, is tiny. I mean, maybe they have $6-7 billion in turnover a year, but a company like Mondelez has got over $30 billion in turnover a year. So it's really important to keep, to understand this nuance in this relationship. And I'll get into that in a future post on the Chocolate Life, which is a reason to go to the Chocolate Life and sign up so you can be notified of new posts on the Chocolate Life. But here we are today talking about ending the cocoa crisis. This is a photograph that I took, the background. I took in Ecuador in 2005, and it shows a cocoa pod which is diseased. And diseases are one symptom of the cocoa crisis, which is leading to reduced productivity. This is, I believe, black pod in Ecuador, but that's not a huge disease in West Africa. Cocoa swollen shoot virus is something that is more prevalent there than it is in the Americas. But I wanted to talk about this shriveling, and that's why I chose this particular image for it. So the thesis is that the global supply chain is confronting a systemic crisis, the global cocoa supply chain, right? It's a confluence of climate-driven agricultural collapse, mounting ethical and regulatory pressures, and unprecedented price volatility, right? And so the question becomes, how is the industry responding? So one thing the industry is doing, and that's what I want to focus on today, is that transforming the search for alternative sources and alternative kinds of cocoa, not just alternative countries, so alternatives to Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana as major producers, but also looking for actual alternatives to cocoa. So Robert, I'm not in a position, so Robert, thank you very much. I'm not in a position to go and explore this TikTok link, but thanks for sharing it with me, and I will go take a look at it after fact. Number one is I can't play the audio, and I can't preview it. So I have no idea what this TikTok link is going to show. And if you can't hear the audio, then I don't know that it makes a whole lot of sense to go and do that. But thanks. I will go and take a look at it after the episode is over, and I'll comment on it in the comments for this post, and maybe respond to it. I will also respond to it on LinkedIn. But thank you very much for sharing that with me. I really do appreciate it. So what I wanted to do, getting back to my thesis, is transforming the search for cocoa alternatives. And again, I'm focusing for the purpose of this episode on actual cocoa alternatives, not new countries, new producing countries, right? Has gone from a niche sustainability initiative to an important strategic imperative, right? So that's where I want to spend part of this. And then I will, at the end, tie everything together. So the first one is that Cargill, which is like the largest privately owned company in the food industry, right? I believe in the world. And it's one of the largest cocoa processors as well. I am in my series, which if we go back to the homepage, you'll notice that I published an article yesterday. It's an op-ed on the changing landscape of cocoa sourcing. So as part of my research on cocoa sourcing, I've been taking a look at, big cocoa traders and just how big they are, right? And I will be talking about specific cocoa traders and how big they are, with the idea being is if you're a chocolate maker and what you want to do is you want to be ethical and you want to be sustainable and you want to be traceable, you need to be able to rely on the companies that you're buying your cocoa from if you're not buying directly from farmers, right? So you need to rely on those people. And how do you figure out if they're ethical, right? And they can be trusted, and you can rely rely on them to be able to back up the claims that you want to make about being sustainable, being traceable, and being ethical. And so that's going to be the second in this 3-part series about exploring the landscape of cocoa sourcing. But let's get back to today's episode and think about that. So Cargill, which is one of the largest cocoa processors in the world, and you may not know this, but it is almost impossible to live a Cargill-free life. That if you go into your local grocery store, what you'll do is you'll find that Cargill supplies ingredients, right? Or in some cases, if you want to buy a sort of ground beef alternative, which is quote unquote plant-based meat, which makes no sense to me. Right? It's an oxymoron. You may find that you're buying it from a source that you think is ethical and you think is doing a good job, but you'll find that, oh, it's Cargill, right? And Cargill is not necessarily, because it is a private company, it doesn't have the same reporting requirements. So you need to think about Cargill and what Cargill is doing. So Cargill, right, is not necessarily investing in new technology. So they're not investing, so becoming a shareholder in companies that are doing the research into bringing cocoa alternatives to market. But what they have done is they've entered into an exclusive global business to business distribution partner with a US company called Voyage Foods, right? Voyage Foods is a direct competitor to another company we'll be talking about, Planet A Foods, that also produces a cocoa for free chocolate alternative. So what Voyage Foods is doing is they're engaging in, they're basically two current approaches to developing cocoa alternatives. One of which is around the idea of precision fermentation, and the other is around the idea of cell culturing. And Voyage Foods is using the former. What they're doing is they're taking agricultural inputs that have no relationship whatsoever to cocoa, like grains, like barley, and they're running them through bioreactors to create substances that are chocolate-like. So you can get a cocoa-like or a chocolate-like product out the other end, but because it doesn't come from cocoa beans, it can't legally be called chocolate. So it may smell like chocolate, it may taste like chocolate, it may or may not behave like chocolate does. It's not legally chocolate. And one of the questions that I have been working on is, what does it taste like? Right. So I've done that with two of the companies that I will mention further down. I've never had a chance. I've never gone out and looked for a Voyage Foods product to be able to taste, and they haven't sent me any. But my experience with tasting these chocolate alternatives is that, or the cocoa alternatives, is that if you're looking to find a replacement for low-cost industrial chocolate, so you've got a candy bar, maybe filled with nougat and caramel and nuts, and what you want to do is you want to do a thin covering of chocolate around it, these chocolate alternatives are not bad from a taste perspective. But if you're in fact if you want a gourmet experience, right? If you want a high-end experience, if you want a specialty chocolate experience, that these products are not going to address that demand. Good or bad, that's the current state of flavor when it comes to these quote unquote chocolate alternatives, including the fact that you can't call them chocolate. So Cargill has said, we're not going to invest in any of this processing technology. What we're going to do is we're going to sign an exclusive distribution agreement with this company and place our bet. And we're going to be using these products and we're going to be reselling them to our customers and incorporating them into the products that we make that other people buy from us, right? And one of the largest cocoa processing plants in the Netherlands, which is in Amsterdam Harbor outside Zaandam, is operated by Cargill. Just so that people know, right? So the Hershey company, right, has invested in a company called Blue Stripes Cacao. And what Blue Stripes Cacao is doing is it's marketing. I don't think it invented any of the technology. And I'm not exactly certain where they're buying these products from, because it's not the obvious company, which is Barry Callebaut, which is got a plant in Ecuador, in Guayas, Ecuador, just down the road from where this technology was invented in the first place. But they've invested in Blue Stripe Cacao, which is a startup company focused on upcycling. So what they're doing is they're taking the pulp, converting it into sugar, adding the sugar into as a replacement for white sugar, processed sugar. They're taking aspects of the pod and they're incorporating aspects of the pod into the product. So what they're looking at doing is saying, can we do more with the fruit, which is normally considered to be waste? This, I think, is a good thing to do if it returns more value to the farmers, right? So, for example, in this case, in order to do what it is that these products are, is that the farmer needs to deliver pods to a processing center, and where the outside of the pod may be disinfected because they want to control the fermentation, or they want to make sure that they can get the juice and the pulp out without fermentation starting. And so, are the farmers being paid the equivalent as they would if they were delivering either wet mass or dried beans to a centro de acopio, right? Or somebody who's going to do the fermentation and drying, or just buy the dried beans and sell them on. So are the farmers being compensated for just delivering the pods? The other thing to consider here is that usually the pods are left in the farm where they degrade and become, return to the soil. The nutrients in the pods return to the soil. And if you don't return the nutrients to the soil through some sort of fertilizer, you have to replace it with something else. And so I would go take a look at any of these things and saying, okay, are we going to replace the nutritional value that would normally be left on the farm? Are we going to replace it as a part of how the farmer is being compensated? For example, it may not be they don't get paid cash, but now the farmer doesn't have to go out and buy fertilizer because as part of the payment for delivering pods, they get fertilizer. So we need to think about what this means, right? Upcycling is a good idea. I'm not really happy with the way Blue Stripes advertises their marketing language. I think is confusing, but that's what Hershey is doing. It doesn't appear that Hershey is investing in cell culturing or precision fermentation technology, either directly within their manufacturing arm or indirectly through their investment arm. So Lindt and Sprüngli, also a very, very large cocoa processor, has confirmed collaboration with this company, Planet A Foods. I Before it was called Planet A Foods, it was called Koa, QOA, and I did a tasting of Koa now probably more than 2 years ago. I wasn't impressed with the quality of the chocolate then. They were delivering bonbons, so it was hard to tell. But Planet A Foods has raised a lot of money, and they now settled on a product line which they call Choviva, and Lindt has a confirmed collaboration with Planet A Foods for using its Choviva product line. It's not entirely clear in which products they're going to be using the Choviva, and there is no direct evidence of a directed, or there's no evidence of a direct investment by Lindt into Planet A Foods, right? But Lindt is saying, hey, we have to hedge our bets with technology. We want a supply chain. The ingredients which go into Choviva can be sourced in Europe, right? We want a supply chain which is much shorter. We don't need to worry at all about the EUDR and the cost of EUDR compliance and the uncertainties associated with EUDR compliance. We don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. We want to shift some or as much as possible of manufacturing to products that that we have a much shorter supply chain that we can control and doesn't rely on cocoa farmers, right? Which is something we want to consider, and we will get to that later on. And earlier this year, I'm not exactly certain the date, Lindt joined an extension seed round. So it was a seed round that was opened up, an extension seed round for a Zurich-based startup called Food Brewer, which is exploring methods of cell culturing cocoa. So here's one of the things that we need to go think about when it comes to food regulation. The first one of which is that if I'm using precision fermentation, so I'm taking an agricultural product, barley or some other grain, and then I'm running it through a chemical process. So usually yeast and other microbes are doing this hydrolysis and other chemical processes to get something which I can use like chocolate, or use to make something which is like chocolate. And that includes lipids. One of the things that precision fermentation can do is it can also generate the fats, not just the non-fat solids. So that's cool. I mean, one of the things that I would love to see is companies like Joviva and people who are working um, on synthesis of lipids would be to replace the need for cocoa butter into pharmaceuticals, and that all of the cocoa butter, which is naturally occurring in the plant, get used for um, food purposes rather than cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. That would, number one, perhaps reduce costs. Certainly, it would reduce demand, and it might serve to alleviate some aspects of the current cocoa sourcing crisis, right? But if I do precision fermentation, because these are all known inputs and known processes, anything that comes out the other side, here in the US, would be called GRAS, GRAS, or generally recognized as safe, right? Whereas anything which is done using cell culturing would be considered to be novel, right? And the regulatory process for novel foods is really long. And so precision fermentation is relatively quick to market, right? And cell culturing may take years. So one is a short-term play and one is a long-term play. And this is where Lint is doing it. So it's saying short-term, we're going to go explore precision fermentation techniques. We got a collaboration with Planet A Foods. Obviously, Lint and Sprügli is headquartered in Zurich, and I believe Planet A Foods is headquartered in Germany. And then they've also investing in biotechnology research, which is a longer term play, which might have much more niche applications when it comes to cell culturing. So there's this. Mars, I couldn't find any reporting that says that Mars is investing in other companies that are doing research into either precision fermentation or into cell culturing. However, Mars has a big research arm. They're known for doing their research. They've obviously got their CocoaVia product, which is an extract of the cocoa flavanols. So they can do that work. But what they have talked about and publicly promoted, and this is something that I brought up in another episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is that Mars is looking at CRISPR, so gene editing technology, to save cocoa from climate chaos. And here's one of the challenges that I face with this. I personally don't have a problem with this kind of genetic modification, right? Right now, there doesn't appear to be any genetically modified cocoa in production, right? I personally don't have a problem with it, especially if what you can do is you can segregate the trees from other trees so that there's no cross-pollination, right? So that the GM trees aren't getting into the general population. And Mars is patenting this process, right? And so the thing we have to worry about is a recreation of Monsanto with respect to seeds. When you buy corn from Monsanto, they own the seeds, right? And if you're found to being mixing the seeds or using them outside of the license, Monsanto can sue your butt off, right? And you do have the problem of, would the pollen from Monsanto uh, corn plant, a corn seed, or soybean or some other, right? And so a lot of Monsanto stuff is to make it Roundup ready, so glyphosate friendly. Um, um, that you run the risk of intellectual property infringement. And so, number one, if Mars wants to patent this, right, we have a problem, right? Which is what happens if one of their trees, which has been modified by this CRISPR process, pollen from that tree, right, goes and is taken either by the wind or by an insect or however, right, is taken to another farm, right? And all of a sudden we have a naturally occurring hybrid, which includes some of the genetics of the Monsanto tree, of the Mars tree. This is a real problem, right? And so if I were a government, so I'm the government of Ghana, I am the government of Nigeria, I am the government of Cameroon or Cote d'Ivoire or any place, what I would say to Mars is you have to give up all IP rights to this before we will consider allowing this genetic material into our country. There's going to be, you cannot enforce the patents on this. If you want to enforce the patents now or 20 years from now, the answer is absolutely not. The other thing that we also need to be aware of is that what Mars has said, let's just replant all the cocoa, right, in West Africa. We'll replace it with a hybridized version of a hybridized variety, and we'll just plant a giant monoculture, right? And it will be disease resistant and pest resistant and more productive, and it won't be any less flavorable than the Amelinado forasteros, which dominate in that part of the world. And one of the challenges we have with that is that monocultures are really bad ideas, right? If you were to so while there's not a huge amount of genetic diversity from the original varieties that were planted in this part of the world, over the course of the last 100 years or so, where where we've started to see the widespread growing of cocoa in that part of the world, we have some genetic diversity, right? But currently nothing that has proven to be resistant to cocoa swollen shoot virus, right? So we could go in and use CRISPR to generate a variety of cocoa that was resistant to CSSV and other diseases which are prevalent in the area. Maybe it's more climate resistant, whatever that means, and maybe it's more productive. An individual tree will grow more pods. Those are all good things. The challenge becomes, who pays to put those trees in the ground? Well, so this is not just the challenge, it is another challenge. Number one, if it's protected by IP, that's a non-starter as far as I am concerned. And if I were an advisor to a government, I would say, no, we're not going to let this happen. Right? But the other one is, who's going to pay for it? Right? Does the individual farmer have to pay? Right? Where does that money come from? Where does the money come from for the farmer to replace aging trees? Where to pay for the labor, to pay for the rootstock? Right? Where does the money come from to pay the farmer for lost productivity while the trees mature? Now, if Mars wants to suggest that we want this cocoa to go into some places, and we're not proposing large monocultures, right? But and we're going to give up our IP rights. If Mars wants to say to a farmer, you replant 4 hectares over the course of several years with this variety, replant your farm over the course of several years with this variety, we'll pay for the rootstock, we'll pay for the labor, and we'll pay for lost productivity. Right? So if Mars is willing to do that, then I think it's something to consider. But if Mars is going to say, no, it is the responsibility of the government, or it is the responsibility of civil society, right, that they pay for this, or the farmer has to pay for it, that's another non-starter. Mars is trying to address one of the root causes, which is productivity, right? There's a lot of cocoa which is lost to climate change. There's a lot of cocoa which is lost to diseases. There's a lot of cocoa which is lost to pests. Can we replace these non-resilient varieties with more resistant varieties so that we can get the productivity numbers up? Mars is at least trying to do that, right? However, I would be very careful, as I've just outlined, in accepting the offer, right? And I hope that you understand where it is that I'm coming from. But if you have a different idea, right, would you just reject GMO outright? Would you go want to see? Do you think that it's the governments should not reject the IP claims? I mean, are you? I'm worried about a Monsanto-like, quasi monopoly around cocoa, which I think, and a limited number of varieties, which would come from such a regime. I think it's a really, really bad idea. But you let me know, right? So Meiji, which is one of the top 10 largest chocolate companies in the world. So Meiji and Isaki Glico, both from Japan, are both in the top 10. Meiji is like in the top 5 of the global 100 largest candy companies. So what Meiji and Puratos. So Puratos is a very large European concern. They're the owner of the brand Belcolade, right? And another brand called Grand Place. I believe Grand Place might be owned by Belcolade. And Grand Place is known for its cacao trace program. But what Meiji and Puratos have both done, right, is they've invested in a California company called California Cultured. And what California Cultured is exploring cell culturing technology. I first wrote about them in one of my first issues for International Confectionery Magazine way back in 2021. But I don't know that they've brought a product to market commercially. Again, because cell cultured cocoa is considered to be uh, a novel product, a novel food product here in the United States. The regulatory hurdles that has to jump through in order to be able to be brought to market, it takes a lot longer, right? Could take 7 years, could take 10 years, could take longer than that to bring a product which is novel into the marketplace. Whereas something that is achieves GRAS status basically, come to market using a crude analogy like grass through a goose, right? It's much easier. But we have Meiji, which is one of the largest candy companies in the world. So this is a consumer-facing company, and Puratos, which is a B2B. So Puratos might be the largest competitor to Barry Callebaut in Belgium, right? So, and they are primarily a B2B company, not a B2C company. Both of them are investing in cell culturing. Right? So Mondelez, largest candy and snack company in the world, over 30 billion in sales last year, has got a venture funding arm called Snack Futures, which is invested in a U.S. company. No, I take that back. I'm not certain where Celeste Bio is from. It may be European. I don't want to. I don't want to overstate, but they've invested in Celeste Bio. Oh, it says right here, Israeli. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking ahead. Which is developing cell cultured cocoa alternatives. And there is at least one other company that I'm aware of that is in Israel that is, unless they've changed their name and it's the same company, and I need to go and take a look at that, which is working on cell cultured cocoa. So the largest consumer snack brand, chocolate and snack in the world, is investing in cell culturing, right? And then a company called Win-Win Food Labs that I've covered here. I will put a link to my article about tasting Win-Win products. So, and a guy founded by a gentleman named Johnny Drain, and Win-Win is focused on precision fermentation technology. Again, looking to shorten the supply chain to the EU, so they don't have to worry about cocoa farms and cocoa farming, and the EDR and climate change and farmer lives and livelihoods. All of that stuff they can ignore because they're buying their inputs, barley. If they're using carob as a flavoring, they can do all that in EU countries. The largest producer of carob in the world, I believe, is Portugal. Like, who knew unless you took a look at this, right? So, but Mondelez, being a big company, they don't tend to invest in basic science, basic research, right? Uh, Directly, like do it in their own labs. They will do small investments in these companies. But even though they didn't invest necessarily in Win-Win Food Labs, they were selected. Win-Win was selected as one of a number of startups for a Mondelez International Collab Accelerator project. So Mondelez is saying, we think this is interesting enough that we want to provide resources to Win-Win to see if they can bring their product to market at scale in a way that's going to be cost effective. And so it turns out, for example, that precision fermentation can bring a product to market when you consider all of the costs involved, including carbon footprint, at a price which is lower than conventional cocoa, now that the price of cocoa is as high as it is. Whereas right now, because of the scale at which cell culturing is done, cell cultured cocoa is more expensive than natural cocoa. But Mondelez, being a big company, having the resources to invest, is saying, let's bet on both of those things, right? So Nestle, right, again, one of the top snack and candy companies in the world, according to reporting out of Confectionery News Magazine, I wasn't able to independently confirm this. Based on reporting, Nestle is not investing in cocoa alternatives made using cell culturing or precision fermentation or some other lab technique, right? Rather, what they're doing is they're looking to make more with less, upcycling in a way. And if we go take a look at this article, What it says here is that Nestle invents a novel technique. And if you do a little bit of work, what you'll find out is this Nestle says, we didn't come up with this. We didn't invent this. We're just taking some idea that other people have done, right? And what Nestle is saying is that if you transport the pod to a facility, what we can do is we can grab the seeds, the wet seeds, and the very, very pliable shell, before you dry it out and it becomes papery. So we can take the seeds, we can take the shell, we can take the pulp, and we can take the placenta, and we can take some of the interior of the cocoa pod, endocarp, I believe. Mesocarp is the outside, endocarp is the inside. So we can take all of those things together and we can grind them up and make them small, and then we can ferment that. And we can take that and we can transform it into something that we can be used to make chocolate, right? That may be true, right? But again, we have the same challenge, which is associated with what upcycling and what Blue Stripes is doing. If the farmer is delivering pods, whole pods to a collection center, how are they being compensated for that? Now, they don't have to take on the market risk of fermentation and drying. So they might ferment properly, but it gets really, really wet and drying happens. I mean, so the farmer is not taking on the market risk. So how do they get paid for this? So this is an economic model that I don't believe is well understood. But then there's also the question of the farmer has delivered the pod to this processing facility. What can they do? How does the nutritional value that is in the pod get returned back to the farm? So as part of the compensation, one of the things that Nestle would have to do is figure out a way to replace the nutritional value of the pods. They'd have to be in the fertilizer business. And what does that look like? Or they can just say, we don't care, right? And I don't know of any reporting one way or the other that says they don't care. But what happens is that makes the farm less productive more quickly, which makes zero sense, right? Makes zero sense. The other question one other question, not the other question, but another question I have about what Nestle is doing is that here in the United States, there's a very strict limit to what percentage of shell can be in the finished chocolate. It's like 1.75%. And it assumes what you're doing is taking dried cocoa beans, cracking and winnowing, and what you have is 1.75% of shell in the cracked winnowed cocoa nibs, right? After roasting, right? And so it's not clear to me, and there's nothing in this article that says, is this going to be considered to be chocolate, right? Because it doesn't follow the current processes and definitions for what chocolate is in the United States. Maybe it does according to the Codex Alimentarius, which is used in many other parts of the world, but in the United States, I don't think this can legally be called chocolate, right? And so what they're saying is we can use more of the pod, there's less waste, right? And because we're using the placenta and the endocarp, we get more volume, we get more mass for this same number of pods. We get more product we can turn into chocolate from the same number of pods. So that makes sense. And again, it's an interesting idea. If Nestle is saying we're going to pay the farmer, right, and the farmer now doesn't need to take on the market risk associated with fermentation and drying, and then we're also going to replace the nutritional value of the pod as part of the compensation structure, not a bad idea, right? I would like to see places where it can happen. And there's an aspect of this that I need to harken back to the 2019 introduction by Barry Callebaut for their Whole Fruit Project. So one of the things about the Whole Fruit Project is they recognize, hey, we have to create a new kind of factory, and that new kind of factory needs to be close to the farms. And by creating a new kind of factory, what we're doing is we're creating a whole lot of new jobs. So rather than my being the third son of a cocoa farmer, right, and then going into the family cocoa farming business, what I could do is I could get an education and go become somebody who works as a process engineer on the factory floor. Or I can get involved in transportation logistics. I can be driving around, picking stuff up and that kind of stuff. So there is the chance, or there's the possibility, that going and taking an approach like Nestle is doing, right, that what you can do is you can change the basic contract around what it means to be a cocoa farmer and what it means to be a cocoa farming community. And this is before you consider the investment of tens of millions of dollars in the processing. So you have to build a building, you need to have an energy source which is consistent, you need to have all of this equipment, right? You need to have people to run equipment. There's a huge investment by a company like Nestle in a cocoa producing country, right? Or Barry Callebaut or anybody who's doing this to do this kind of project, right? And so we need to take into account what that is. Is it addressing the farming family livelihood issue? Maybe not, right? Which I want to address. The other thing is that even though they didn't invent this process, they're not the first company to do this. What they've done is they patented it. And I have the same problem, right? If I'm a country and I want to invite Nestle into doing this, and this is patented, I'm going to say, give up your patent rights on this, right? I don't want you protecting the patent this way. The barrier to entry in terms of investment in a producing country is really high, right? And so we've got that. So if you wanted to exercise the patent rights outside the producing country, so somebody tries to bring this product to market and they use the same technique outside the country, it's a gray area legally. I'm not certain how you can selectively enforce a patent that way, but we do need to address the issue that this is a patented technology, and what does it mean for a producing country to have a company, right, company invest in the technology, a plant, right, and what the patents mean in terms of lockup about what's going on. So there is that. Right. So if you want to read the patent, there are two of them which I could find. So here are the patents. There's a link to one. Here's a link to another. Right. And what it says in the patent, right, is the present invention seeks to provide methods and products that utilize other portions of the fruit of Theobroma genus plants. So this is not just Theobroma cacao, but it's Theobroma bicolor, Theobroma grandiflorum, Coupoisou, just any member of the Theobroma genus. There are three which are used. T cacao is the one that's most used, but there are another 20 some odd members of the Theobroma genus. The products and methods offer advantages to sustainability. I don't necessarily know that that's the case because of the manufacturing infrastructure. So even though it claims that they offer advantages in sustainability, I don't think those advantages are clearly set out in the patent. I don't know that they need to be set out in a patent. There are claims which need to be backed up. Is it reduced carbon footprint? What are they? Right. Additionally, the present invention provides processes that allow potential ingredients inside plants to be commercially effective. So, for example, might we improve the level of bioavailable cocoa flavonols and polyphenols? That's the way I interpret this. Right. So again, what's not disclosed in the patent in detail is how harvest and post-harvest processes are changed, right? Whole pods need to be delivered. And then there's a question of, did this match CFR 21.163 here in the United States? My reading is it probably doesn't. And then the Codex Alimentarius in other parts of the world. The other way that people are taking a look at this is that people are saying, let's just change our recipes. So we're going to use less cocoa, we're going to use compound and things like that. What I want to get to, and even though I did this negligible risk update for the EUDR, I put it in here because it is a response to the cocoa process. The EUDR is a response. It says cocoa is in part responsible for deforestation. We here in the EUDR do not want to contribute to ongoing deforestation, and therefore, if you want to bring cocoa into the EU, you're going to have to comply with this new set of regulations, the EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulations. And so what I did is there was an update which is posted this week on the concept of negligible risk. I talked about this in an episode of Pod Safe Chocolate a couple of weeks ago. If I remember, I'll put a link in here. But if you are interested in the EUDR and want to read the update, you can download the updated regulations here. And I did a highlight on a couple of the top issues associated with it. And what I want to do for the last couple of minutes of this episode is to say that none of this addresses the underlying root causes of the cocoa crisis, right? So if we go take a look in the thesis where I highlight the global supply chain is confronting a systemic crisis. It is a confluence of climate-driven agricultural collapse, mounting ethical and regulatory pressures, and price volatility. But the price volatility is a symptom of supply chain challenges, right? And the systemic crisis, right, that aspect which is not mentioned here, right? And I wanted to talk about it, right, rather than put it in the version of the post which was put together before the episode. What I want to talk about is the fact that for at least the last 50 years, since the 1970s, right, Big Chocolate, right, has not invested in cocoa farms or cocoa farmers. There has been no systemic investment by Big Chocolate in cocoa farms and cocoa farmers, right? And therefore, with an aging farmer population, an aging farm population, right, which leads to low productivity, but the aging trees are going to be less resilient to climate change. They're going to be less resistant to disease, right? By not investing in farms and farmers, by pushing the price of cocoa to be as low as it possibly can, below the cost of sustainable production for most of the last 50 years in many places in the world, and particularly West Africa. Right? That simple fact of a lack of systemic investment in farms and farmers and the pursuit of short-term profits, right, has been a part of the right systemic crisis, one of the factors which is part of this confluence of events, right? There has been no investment in climate resilience until the last couple of years. There has been no systemic investment in disease resistant other than to try to breed new plants, right? But as I say, you breed a new plant, if you want to replace, a million trees, who pays for replacing the million trees? Are you going to replace 1 million trees that had been in the ground for 20, 30, 40, 50 years with a brand new monoculture? And we all know that monocultures are really, really, really bad idea, right? And how do you solve a monoculture problem? With a patented fertilizer. You build Roundup Ready genes into the trees. Not that I think that Mars would go to Monsanto and do that, right? Monsanto now owned by Bayer, or somebody like that. Don't quote me on that. I'm just riffing, right? Do you build, Roundup Ready genes into cocoa trees and then quote unquote solve the problem with glyphosate? Right. I think that from a GM prospect, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Right. But the industry in general, right? You've got 130 billion plus a year, depending on if you include certain forms of snacks, beverages, frozen desserts, and things like that. It may be maybe 50% more than that. Could be 180 billion or more. That there's some cocoa thing in it, in the product, and can be counted towards that 130, 180 billion. Right? There's enough money in the system. Right? There's enough profits in the system in order to be able to address the problem of replacing aging trees, right? What we want to do, I think, is to be able to promote a system where we're growing the same amount of cocoa or a little bit more in half the land. If we can grow the same amount of cocoa in half the land, what we can do is return the land that we're not using for cocoa and do other things with it. Biodiversity corridors, turning it back, reforest it, right? There are all sorts of things that we can do if what we can do is we can put more productive trees into production, put them into farms. But the question is, who pays for it? Governments should not pay for it, except to the extent that they're complicit, right, in the problem. So, for example, in a controlled economy like Ghana, right, there has not been systemic investment in cocoa farms by COCOBOD, right? There just hasn't been any. They've been doing Band-Aid farmer training and this and that and the other, and providing fertilizer and this and that and the other, but they really haven't thought through their responsibility and what they're going to do with their margin between the farm gate price and what it is that the export price of the cocoa is. So maybe the government pays for it out of its margin, right? Or it pays for it in part. Civil society, non-profit organizations shouldn't be required to step up and pay for these things. Is fair trade going to do it? Absolutely not. Their economic model breaks down immediately, right? If they have to go in and be responsible for paying for that aspect. It's not their business. That they're part of the certification industrial complex. Their job is not to improve farms and farmers. Their job is to make sure that the farmers follow a checklist, right, of things that people in producing countries or consuming countries think is important. Right? The farmers don't care about that kind of record keeping. The only reason they're doing that kind of record keeping is because the certification requires them to do that record keeping. I don't think NGOs should step in to fit the bill. I don't think that most NGOs have the resources to fit the bill. And then we shouldn't think about planting monocultures. We should be resistant to planting monocultures. We should be throwing, to borrow a trope, as many different shapes of spaghetti against as many different vertical surfaces as we can in different parts to see what works best. And from a best practices perspective, go and apply those things. We should use advanced technology having to do with climate prediction and satellite and understanding soil and lots of things that are being done. I talked about this a long time ago with people from Ingeman and a company called their business called Agroclimatica, which is doing that and demonstratively improving the output of farms by understanding weather patterns, among other things, and when not to use agricultural inputs. There are lots of ways we can go do this, and who should pay for it? And the answer to the question is Big Chocolate needs to step up to the plate and take responsibility for the fact that they caused the crisis that we're in through a lack of systemic involvement, right, or systemic investment over the course of at least the last 50 years, since the run-up in prices in the 1970s, which is the last time we've seen these high prices in cocoa. Big Chocolate has been all about how do we keep the price as low as we possibly can, right? And they're reaping the problems. The one thing that I want to leave everyone with as I end this episode is that we do not want to give Big Chocolate an off-ramp, right? By saying you can replace your chocolate from cocoa beans with chocolate alternatives, which are either precision fermented or cell cultured. We don't want you to do that, because what that means is that we're giving you permission to abandon cocoa farmers. We're giving you permission to avoid taking responsibility for the crisis that you created. There is not going to be any meaningful financial harm to the problem that you created. And so when you take a look at cell cultured cocoa, cool technology, right? When you go take a look at precision fermentation, cool technology. When you go take a look at CRISPR, right, and what it means, cool technology, I can see applications for it. When you go take a look and see what it is that Nestle is doing by trying to do more with less, cool technology. But fundamentally, we don't want to let them off the hook for their role in contributing to the crisis that is currently existing in cocoa. And so I don't know any big company that's actually doing this. So no, right? None of the big companies that I mentioned is in fact ending the crisis in cocoa. They don't have any plans to do it. They're just looking to find ways to avoid taking responsibility for it. And that's how I'm going to close, right? And say, hey, everybody, thanks for joining me on this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. You can go to The Chocolate Life right now. You can support The Chocolate Life, because this episode of Pod Save Chocolate like every episode, is supported by the members of The Chocolate Life. There's always a free membership. There has been since The Chocolate Life was founded in 2008, 17 plus years ago. But if you do have the resources to support the work that I do financially, you can go there. There's for as little as $5 a month. If you want to pay it by the year, it's $42 a year. If you want to pay more, there are coaching and consulting hours. So you can talk to me about the issues that you're having with your cocoa or chocolate business, and I can tell you what it is that I think. Right. And then but that's it. That's it for this episode. I have no idea what this coming Tuesday's episode is going to be, but I want to end this episode by saying thank you to everybody who's watched this far. I want to thank all of the subscribers to The Chocolate Life and the premium members who make this possible, and to remind you that if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Ciao, everybody. Until the next time.